Good evening and welcome to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I am your host, Robert Spencer, and we have tonight a very special guest continuing in our profiles and interviews with noted freedom fighters in the world today. We have tonight one of the world's leading authorities on Islamic anti-Semitism, Andrew BOSTOM, the author of The Legacy of Jihad, The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, and other books. Andy, your latest book is Sharia versus Freedom, is that right?
Yes, yes, and it has a legacy subtitle, The Legacy of Islamic Totalitarianism.
Excellent, excellent. And our topic at hand tonight is Bernard Lewis, who is noted and renowned as one of the leading scholars of Islam and the Middle East, the Islamic world in general. He is universally lauded, over 90 years old now. He is the go-to authority for the Bush administration during the Gulf War, that is the second Iraqi war, and he is somebody who is universally respected. And yet you yourself have written an article, a very provocative and interesting article entitled Bernard Lewis, the Pied Piper of Islamic Confusion. And so perhaps just to start us off, you could explain why on earth you would call him such a thing.
Well, there is an opening caveat. Of course, Professor Lewis, over a career that now spans almost 70 years, is in fact a very distinguished scholar and has contributed, particularly in his later years, some very valuable popularizations of Islamic history and culture. And obviously over the course of 70 years has done some outstanding, particularly linguistic work, a great study on the emergence of Republican Turkey from the Ottoman Empire. But along with all the deserved accolades, and he is now 96 years old, and he's simply a medical marvel at this point, I began to notice I would say, you and I were both involved with the early versions of one of our mutual mentors, Batyor's Eurabia, and when that book came out, in the course of reviewing it, Lewis had made a very provocative statement at the time, just one of these things that he says occasionally about how Europe was going to become a Muslim continent, and in light of what I was already by then learning about some of his scholarship, the question arose, well, why would he object to that? And I guess that was sort of the genesis of this, because there's always been a very, very apologetic strain that I noticed to his writing. And it really was part and parcel of some very fundamental areas in the study of Islam. I was not happy with his discussions when he went into them of even something as basic as the jihad as an institution. Certainly his assessment of how the Sharia was applied to non-Muslims I found extraordinarily apologetic, and then specifically essentially his denial of theological anti-Semitism. But also, as you let in, he had a lot to do in terms of advising the democratization project as it's unfolded, particularly and most pronouncedly perhaps with the invasion of Iraq. And there I developed this long essay that you referred to, which was essentially incorporated into my new book. There I was really taken aback, because this notion of, it was probably epitomized in an essay he wrote that was published in 2006. It was actually a lecture that he did during a Hillsdale College tour. And it ended with this line, "Bring them freedom or they destroy us." And that line became the title of this piece, which was widely circulated. And it was a breathtaking statement, particularly in light, I just have to read this, Bob, of what Lewis had said roughly 50 years earlier in a very, very straightforward discussion of the totalitarian nature of Islam. So just to give you background, in 1954, Lewis wrote a brilliant essay called Islam and Communism, and basically what he was doing, he was trying to analyze whether Muslim societies would be receptive to communism. And one of his fears was that they might be very receptive to communism. And in laying out that possibility, he wrote what I think is one of the most honest and really insightful assessments of the similarities between communism and Islam. And I want people to keep that in mind, fast forwarding to what he wound up advising, with regard to Iraq and elsewhere. He says, I turn now from the accidental to the essential factors, to those deriving from the very nature of Islamic society, tradition, and thought. The first of these is authoritarianism. Perhaps we may even say the totalitarianism of the Islamic political tradition. He says many attempts have been made to show that Islam and democracy are identical, attempts usually based on a misunderstanding of Islam or democracy or both. This sort of argument expresses a need of the uprooted Muslim intellectual who is no longer satisfied with or capable of understanding traditional Islamic values, and who tries to justify, or rather restate, his inherited faith in terms of the fashionable ideology of the day. It is an example of the romantic and apologetic presentation of Islam that is a recognized phase in the reaction of the Muslim thought to the impact of the West. The political history of Islam is one of almost unrelieved autocracy. And he goes on to describe in great detail the dangerous similarities between the Sharia and communist totalitarianism, and the idea that even the jihad, holy war, is mirrored in the doctrinal belief in communism to assume global supremacy. And he ends with a very funny, I didn't realize that this was apparently a commonplace in the 1950s. He goes on to discuss the concept of Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Islam, and its communist equivalents, that there could not be peace between, say, the communist and the non-communist world. And then he says, the humorist who summed up the communist creed as "there is no God and Karl Marx is his prophet" was laying his finger on real affinity. I mean, he was humorous, he was honest, he was open, and what I discovered is that in that period, in the 1950s, even though there was a slight apologetic strain, he was perhaps too optimistic about certain experiments that were taking place at that time, particularly in Turkey, his beloved Turkey, but also in Pakistan. He was very guarded back then, and he certainly felt that these experiments could fail. And then what I noticed is that there was absolute silence, literally over the next 40 years, whereas other scholars, including contemporaries of Lewis, particularly P.J. Vitikiotis, who worked with Lewis at the School of Oriental and Asiatic Studies in Great Britain, Vitikiotis' thought on these matters was similar to Lewis until the Khomeini Revolution. In other words, Vitikiotis thought that some of these experiments with constitutional efforts at political experiments that did not include Sharia governments, etc., dabblings with Western ideas, lots of problems, of course, with autocracies, more secular autocracies intervening and coups, etc., etc. But Vitikiotis kept an open mind until the Khomeini Revolution, and then wrote a brilliant analysis, which basically said, because of the nature of Islam, even with these secular, pseudo-secular experiments, there were only two poles. There was an authoritarianism that was more secular, for example, like we saw in Egypt recently in the Mubarak period, and then there was the return to theocratic Islam. and that the soil was just impregnated with this kind of authoritarian ideology, which ultimately was rooted in Islam. And he was very distraught that there would be that they would ever escape this sort of Scylla and Charybdis poles. But he made a comment about it. Lewis, I found, never addressed all these failed experiments in the lead up to Iraq, for example. Lewis, who in the 1950s admitted that if we went back to the French invasion of the Middle East and the Napoleonic period, that even 150 years after that, with various experiments in Western forms of government and parliamentary systems, even very inchoate experiments, that 150 years later, they really hadn't proceeded very far, and yet he had this guarded optimism about Pakistan, about Turkey in the 1950s. But literally up around the time of between that period and the invasion of Iraq, he made no such commentary the way his colleague Batikiotis had about, well, yes, these experiments have played out and they're back to all these autocratic systems. And then he launches into, you know, Islamic democracy. And I just found that breathtaking.
Yeah, you know, Andy, it really is, because you mentioned that he loves Turkey, and I know that Bernard Lewis has a lot of ties in Turkey and a tremendous respect for the Kemalist experiment there. And do you know if he has made any public statement about the now rapidly accelerating dismantling of Kemalist secularism and the re-Ottomization and Shariaization of Turkey?
He's made some very casual, you know, he's unhappy, obviously, Robert. He's not happy with Erdogan, but it's really worse than that. You know, it does bring to mind another very good comparison with someone who, I don't know how close they were, but I think they did have a collegial relationship. Uriel Hyde was an Ottomanist, but also a scholar of modern Turkey. And 6 weeks before he died suddenly, he gave a remarkably prescient lecture at Hebrew University. They were just endowing a chair in his honor, and he was going to lead some Middle East studies program at the Hebrew University. And his background was actually kind of interesting. Hyde had grown up in Germany, got out, spent time in Turkey, learned the language, went into the diplomatic corps, and then went back and became a scholar. So he was a true scholar diplomat, and very sympathetic to Kemalist Turkey, and fluent in the language, but had written some honest critiques of the Ottoman Empire. And also, this lecture that he gave literally 6 weeks before he passed away, he was chastising himself. Remember, Robert, this is 1968. Hyde was chastising himself for being slow on the uptake, with the fact that within the very decade after Ataturk's death, Turkey began what he saw in 1968 as its inexorable re-Islamization. Imagine that. In 1968, he was too slow. He was criticizing himself for being too slow. He pointed to the fact that in the first two-party election, the party the Democrat Party that pandered to the never repressed fundamentalist sentiments in Turkey gained the upper hand in the elections. There was the reintroduction of the Muezzin call. There was opening of formerly closed Sufi schools. The whole process was really set in motion literally 10 years or so after Ataturk's death. And by 1968, so Ataturk died in 1938, by 1968, Hyde was chastising himself for being too slow to realize that these forces were already unleashed, and that there was going to be an inevitable change in Turkey to something that was not going to be the Kemalist experiment, which had its own flaws, but that secularization was really at risk already by 1968.
Well,
I
he was actually prescient in saying that, I would think, because you know, you and I know, Andy, that in both of us from 2001 on, have been told ad infinitum. Not so much recently, not so much in the last couple of years, in my experience, but I'm sure that you've had the same experience all through from 2001 to about 2008 or 9. People constantly saying, "Oh, things are going to be okay. Look at Turkey. Turkey is the way of the future in the Islamic world." And
absolutely.
as more and more Muslim countries become like Turkey, then these problems will resolve themselves. And of course, instead, the Turks have gone the other way. And if Hyde saw that coming in 1968, he was way ahead of the curve as far as most of the analysts of the region have seen Turkey.
Well, but what's interesting, Robert, is that Lewis himself, again, this is the contradiction in Lewis. Lewis wrote a very honest piece in the 1950s. Like Hyde, he was concerned about that first two-party election expression of the public will, but he blew it off. Unlike Hyde, Hyde initially probably did blow it off, but by 1968, Hyde was convinced that the trends are really bad. Lewis observed the trend back in the first two-party election in 1950, I believe it was, but essentially dismissed it. And Hyde, took it as an omen, and within by 1968 was convinced that things were really bad. And this is what I don't understand about Lewis. He apparently has this sort of Panglossian streak in him, which becomes overwhelming. His best wishes about things in the Islamic world really outstrip his reasoning capacity.
Yeah, I've noticed that actually in my own reading of his works. Of course, as you noted, the breadth of his work is extraordinary, and the value of it is immense. But sometimes it seems to me that he piles up a great deal of detail and marshaling, in other words, a great deal of evidence, and yet never really explicates what the evidence is designed to illustrate. And I think that one of the foremost aspects of this is the concept of dimitude that the pioneering historian Bat-Yaor has blazed the trail in illuminating. And he has, as you noted, been almost disdainful of her work, and yet in his own work, not really in any one place, but as you read into the immense body of his work, you can't help but find anecdotal incidents related of the mistreatment of non-Muslims and often how that mistreatment was institutionalized. And yet he never seems to draw the conclusions that are really rather obvious from that these are intrinsic aspects of Islamic law. This is something that I'm not aware that he ever discusses at length. And
No,
so,
as a matter of fact, Bob, he pretty much does the opposite. So essentially, what he says, he writes in 1974 that, quote, the dimmer worked. He writes that. And what does he mean by that? He means that, if anything, there was occasional mild persecution, but that the dhimmis thrived. This is literally what he says. It's this Panglossian reductio ad absurdum, and it's not just our mutual mentor and who's a great scholar, Bat-Yaor, who Lewis was not appropriate with in terms of downplaying her work and et cetera and other things. What's really striking is that two other colleagues of Lewis's, someone who he edited the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Islam with, Anne Lambton. Anne Lambton wrote an analysis, a summary analysis of the dhimmi condition, which was as strong as anything that Bat-Yaor wrote. And this was a colleague of Lewis's. Shlomo Dov Goitain, who worked with Lewis when Lewis was at Princeton. uh, wrote, Lewis, on the one hand, says there is no theological anti-Semitism in Islam, and of course, it combines that with the fact that there is no, and he writes it very derisively, Dini-Tud is a myth, he says. Well, Goitain analyzed the Geniza documentary record, which was this vast trove of religious and non-religious documents, letters, etc., that was discovered in Cairo, and became the source of an excellent primary source of materials to study medieval Muslim-Jewish relations. And Goitain was the great scholar of this incredible archival source. Goitain wrote that the Jews had literally coined their own word for Muslims' specific hatred of them, during the Middle Ages, and he said that this word was the equivalent for Islamic anti-Semitism. And then, of course, he goes on to document, in many cases, the plight of the Jews under Islam, and wrote a brilliant essay on the jizya, on the poll tax, in the early 1960s, and how onerous it was, and how so many other regulations were attached to it, and how the effect of the dhimmi condition, or dhimmitude, and actually both Lambton and Goitain refer to this, literally extinguished populations across the length and breadth of Islamdom. So you have Lewis's own colleagues, who's, at least in their summary assessment, you're right, at times he will give you anecdotes which suggest these things. But in his summary assessment, again, it's this Panglossian tendency, and frankly, it's not shared by other historians who were his contemporaries and his equals.
And so it's important to emphasize that we're not here tonight to pick on the man, and we're not here to slight the great achievement of his academic corpus. But what we are trying to do is to caution people who are interested in studying in these fields, in taking Bernard Lewis as the sole or even the primary authority on some of the key issues that affect public policy today, particularly Islam's doctrine of jihad warfare against unbelievers, and the doctrine of dhimmitude, the institutionalized oppression of non-Muslims in the Islamic State. It's very important to remember that Bernard Lewis was indeed taken as the sole, if not the primary, the primary, if not the sole authority in prosecuting the Iraq War, and that probably the disastrous democracy project that resulted from it, which was foredoomed, and which I wrote an article about in 2003, before there were any troops in Iraq, saying that it would never work. It was based essentially on Lewis's teachings that you have adumbrated today, that he completely contradicted what he had written about Islamic authoritarianism and totalitarianism in the 50s, and started talking about the prospects of our bringing freedom to Iraq. This is why it is important for us to discuss these issues and to confront this great scholar's legacy, because it is a mixed bag, and it is one that can lead to, and has led to, policies that are disastrous, that are wrong-headed, that have needlessly cost billions of dollars, thousands of lives, and that it is extraordinarily important for public policy analysts, government and law enforcement and the media to re-examine, if they have any disposition to do so, in order to try to determine whether this is really a road that, in the interests of the United States, we should be going down.
Well, there's almost, Robert, absolutely, and your work. I remember your essay, your was a blog post or a formal essay was very prescient in 2003. But there is this quality. There's a couple of problems. It's almost as if Lewis is at war with himself. It's like the old Mad magazine, Spy versus Spy. I mean, after all, who better laid out the totalitarian nature of Islam and its anti-democratic essence than Lewis himself? I mean, this is what's so maddening about it. Again, in 1990, and I'm sure this in some way inspired Samuel Huntington. Lewis wrote a very, very prescient piece for foreign policy where he described the clash of civilizations that was underway. Um, and and but the difference between Huntington and Lewis is that Huntington took that seriously. It wasn't just a cliche for him. He went back as the great political scientist that he was. He marshaled a tremendous amount of data. It's truly a remarkable book that deserves to be reread, The Clash of Civilizations, because what he showed is that even with the totalitarian movements of the 20th century, even factoring in all the havoc and destruction that they wrought, both communism and fascism, Nazism, that when you just patiently added up all the wars that took place within Islamdom and on his what Huntington famously described as the bloody borders of Islamdom, it was more consistent and worse, and that it resulted from what Huntington laid out and said. He said it's not a question of fundamentalist Islam, it's a question of Islam as a rival dominating civilization that settles its grievances, whatever they may be, in a violent way. This was Huntington's conclusion, marshaling hard data. He didn't just put out, a very nice, catchy, a phrase, the clash of civilizations, which in fact Lewis had done. Lewis is a great wordsmith. He analyzed it and came away with a conclusion that this is a major problem going forward in the so-called Francis Fukuyama end of history. That was part of his reason that he felt that Fukuyama was nonsensical in that formulation. But that's the difference. I mean, even something as basic as jihad, Robert, I was shocked. I was told that one of Lewis's best books is The Political Language of Islam. Well, if you go into that book and you look carefully at how he describes the Dar al-Harb, it's very bowdlerized compared to other great scholars who wrote specifically about the Dar al-Harb, like Armand Abel, like the great Joseph Schacht. They describe that this means that the lives of those not outside the governance of the Sharia are quite literally licit, and that they can be attacked at any time, and they can be enslaved, etc. Lewis makes no mention of that. Lewis also does not describe jihad martyrdom appropriately. He basically just says, well, suicide is prohibited by Islam. And that's just a small piece of the puzzle. David Littman, to his credit, pointed out a wonderful essay written in 1946 by Franz Rosenthal, which was obviously available to Lewis. And Rosenthal was another great Western scholar of Islam, who Lewis certainly knew about. Rosenthal described how, suicide for melancholia is not sanctioned by Islam, but jihad martyrdom is a pillar of Islam. And so, I even noticed that Lewis did not accurately represent the whole concept of jihad martyrdom. So this becomes very problematic, as you stated, Robert, because he is the go-to source for so many people who, unlike us, are not going to read him in his totality and see the contradictions and see the good and see the stuff that's very apologetic and just maybe set that aside. These people basically read the apologia, and then they go and launch off democracy projects.
Yes, and well, the consequences have indeed been disastrous. We are going to take a break now for some very important messages. This is ABN's Jihad Watch program with Robert Spencer and our special guest, the world's leading authority on Islamic anti-Semitism, Andrew BOSTOM, and we are discussing the mixed legacy of the great scholar Bernard Lewis. We'll be right back with more after this. Welcome back to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I'm Robert Spencer. Our guest tonight is Dr. Andrew BOSTOM, author of Sharia versus Freedom, The Legacy of Islamic Totalitarianism, as well as two other earlier books, The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism and The Legacy of Jihad. We're discussing tonight Bernard Lewis, the world's leading scholar on Islam in general, and the one who is most respected. There are, however, some troubling aspects of his legacy, of his influence, and that is the topic at hand. Not here again to just pick on the man, but to point out for analysts and policymakers the difficulties and the dangers, the pitfalls of following Lewis uncritically in light of some of the contradictions and misleading information in his work, which can have given rise to very serious policy errors on the part of the United States of America and European states. Andy, you mentioned before the break, just in passing several times, that Lewis actually rejects the idea that there is any Islamic anti-Semitism embedded within Islamic teaching itself. This seems to me unbelievable in light of the extraordinary breadth, the extraordinary abundance of Quranic material, saying that the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims, that the Jews were transformed into apes and pigs for breaking the Sabbath, such that we still hear Islamic supremacists and jihadis, including most recently, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, Mohammed Morsi, referring to Jews today as the descendants of apes and pigs. We hear that in the Quran that they are under Allah's curse several times, that humiliation and debasement will be their lot for all of time, that they, along with the Christians, are the vilest of created beings. How is it that, and on what grounds does Lewis dismiss all of that?
It's remarkable, Robert. You know, when I found this passage, I knew that another mutual colleague of ours, Mark Dury, was working on a book on the dhimmi condition, and I emailed it to him. You know, it was one of the, and he wrote back to me that no, I must have gotten it wrong. He didn't believe it. So I said, well, you know, here's the citation. You know, do Google Books or wait till you get the book in the mail itself and read it. I said, but I'll read you what I sent to him, which he just refused to believe. It comes from Lewis's, I guess, really his longest treatment of the subject of dhimmitude, of the Sharia-based restrictions and their impact on non-Muslims. He says, in Islamic society, hostility to the Jew is non-theological. It is not related to any specific Islamic doctrine, nor to any specific circumstance in Islamic history. For Muslims, it is not part of the birth pangs of their religion, as it is for Christians. Now, you can't get more definitively negative than that. And of course, this was 1984. As late as 2004, I believe this was written. He says, again, this is where he says, dhimmi, and it's in quotes, -tude, subservience and persecution and ill treatment of Jews is a myth. You know, again, it's really more in the summary formulations that he runs he runs afoul of the truth, the historical truth, the doctrinal truth.
Andy, that's just so extraordinary that he actually not only denies the reality of Quran-based Islamic anti-Semitism, and I haven't even mentioned the Hadith. You know, of course, right. Foremost is the notorious Hadith about Muslims will kill Jews. Actually, Muhammad says the end times will not come until Muslims kill Jews and the Jews hide behind trees and the trees cry out, "Oh, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him," which makes killing the Jews an eschatological imperative which will hasten the coming of the end times and the consummation of all things.
Absolutely. The fact that the Dajjal, the Muslim Antichrist, is either formally identified as being Jewish and or is always accompanied by Jews that'll be slaughtered, whether it's in Isfahan or whether it's in Jerusalem, Yeah, it's just the even the terrible breach in Christianity, in Islam, which violated its political innocence, quote unquote. The Shiite split from the Orthodox Sunni Islam. Um, the the origins of that, according to no less authority than Tabari, that derives from a quote unquote renegade Yemenite Jew, Abdullah ibn Saba, who fomented the Shiite heresy and brought about that tragedy in Islamic history. How is that not part of the birth pangs of Islam? All the seerah, which you know better than anyone, which are just rife with anti-Semitic incidents, with Muhammad himself invoking the Jews and pigs before he has the Qurayza tribe massacred. It's an endless litany. One of the things that I included in its totality for this very specific reason was a 70-page, 200-odd referenced essay published in 1937 in French, but I had it translated into English for The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, by someone who Lewis also knew, Georges Weide. And Weide gets into all the eschatological Islamic anti-Semitism that you alluded to, as well as the daily life, corporeal world anti-Semitism in the Hadith. It just rife with it. Going all the way back to the mid-1880s, and of course known to Lewis, was a remarkable series of essays by Hartwig Hirschfeld on the anti-Semitism in the Seerah. It's stunning. As recently as 1988, to go forward, there was a great essay by an Israeli scholar reviewing Quranic anti-Semitism and particularly getting into some of the Quranic commentaries. It's impossible that Lewis was just completely oblivious to this work.
It really is, and then it makes one wonder. And then to compare Islamic anti-Semitism positively or favorably to Christian anti-Semitism. Christian anti-Semitism is a terrible reality, and there is no minimizing it. But the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church actually directly contradicted Lewis's claim that you mentioned earlier, that the Islamic anti-Semitism is not doctrinal in the way that Christian anti-Semitism is. The Catholic Church, which is still the largest Christian body, expressly rejected the interpretations of the New Testament that gave rise to Christian anti-Semitism and rejected Christian anti-Semitism as a concept, whereas there has been no body, not Al-Azhar University, not anywhere, that has rejected Islamic anti-Semitism. On the contrary, as our late mutual friend David Littman has documented, and you have as well, Al-Azhar has been at the forefront, and Sheikh Mohammed Sayyid Tantawi, the former Grand Sheikh who passed away a few years ago, was one of the foremost exponents of Islamic anti-Semitism as a doctrine, as an unshakable dogma of Islam.
Absolutely. I mean, Tantawi's magnum opus was a 700-page, originally his PhD thesis, which was reproduced as a celebrated book, and really was his entree to eventually becoming the Grand Imam, the Muslim equivalent of a pope at Al-Azhar University for 14 years. It's a 700-page treatise devoted to not only illustrating, but celebrating for all times the worst anti-Semitic motifs in the Quran, in the Quranic commentaries, and in the traditions. He's the polar opposite of then Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict the 16th, who dedicated his life to expunging the deicide allegation and has continued to write about it, and whose first act was to go to a synagogue in Cologne, which the Nazis had destroyed. It was his first trip outside the Vatican confines itself. These are polar opposites, and Lewis never acknowledges things like this. And in fact, there was a very interesting review of the legacy of Islamic anti-Semitism by a European historian, Robert Kaplan, who pointed out that Lewis engages in a very snide parlor trick, where the reason he says there's no doctrinal anti-Semitism in Islam is because his a priori definition of anti-Semitism is based on Christian anti-Semitism. It's just absurd, the lengths he's gone to.
It is incredible. And, you know, also, I think that it's noteworthy that Christian anti-Semitism and Islamic anti-Semitism are both grim and terrible realities, but that at the dawn of the 20th century, the vast majority of Jews lived in Christian Europe rather than in the Islamic world. And that if voting with one's feet has any validity, then clearly they were affirming that in the Christian world at that time, they had it better than in the Islamic world. And this is, I think, also something that I document in my own book, Religion of Peace, from 2007, in which I quote a great deal of work from your Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, that the anti-Semitism in Christianity was never a constant and never something that was taught from on high and was universal. It was always, it was undeniable and terrible, and it makes me sick to read the accounts of it. But it was something that was sporadic and was always counterbalanced by Christian leaders, including popes, who were trying to limit it and trying to fight against it. Whereas there is no current like that in Islam, some sort of a pro-Jewish or mitigating force to Islamic anti-Semitism, all the way up until the last few years when Noni Darwish founded Arabs for Israel. Before that,
right,
there's nothing.
No, it really. I couldn't agree with you more. And in terms of the demography, again, our late colleague David Littman would repeatedly say, look, you know, if you take for the mid 13th century, the Mamluk period, the Mamluk dynasty, roughly 90% of Jews lived within Islamdom. Certainly by the end of the 19th century, that demography has reversed, where as you pointed out, 90% of Jews lived in Christendom, with all its problems, with pogroms, with paroxysms of violence, et cetera, with obvious persecution. The situation overall had improved and was getting better. Even this mythical nonsense about the Ottoman Empire and the period of the Spanish Inquisition is so grotesquely misrepresented. If I might just quickly summarize, you have a period. First of all, the prototype for the Inquisition may very well have been what was just as brutal, if not more brutal, less documented, but at least as brutal, which was the Almohad Inquisition. The Almohad Berber Muslims were very fanatical. They destroyed Christian and Jewish communities throughout North America and within Spain itself. They forcibly converted surviving Jews. Those surviving Jews were put under the same conditions of the Inquisition, essentially, and this took place in the 12th into the beginning of the 13th century. Maimonides survived this, and a lot of the communities that escaped to parts of Christian-held Spain and elsewhere, where in that period of time there was more tolerance for them in those Christian-held areas of Spain, and they thrived. Now, of course, the period of fanaticism in Spain, the Inquisition takes place, and most of the Jews, we can get this from the great scholarship of Bibi Netanyahu's father and Henry Kamen, most of the Jews were converted. The few that remained Jews were obviously persecuted, but wound up being expelled, not to the Ottoman Empire, to other more tolerant parts of Europe. A small community of Jews, roughly 20,000, maybe less, were in fact taken in by the Ottoman Empire But what was the vacuum that they filled? They filled the vacuum created by the Ottoman jihad conquests of both Christians and Jews. And those Jews were not very happy. Those were the Jews of the Byzantine Empire, were not very happy about their plight. So these Jews from Spain filled these areas. It was a population transfer called Surgun. And those Jews that came over to the Ottoman Empire could be moved again, and were in fact moved again when the Ottoman Empire expanded, often against their will. And these Surgun Jews, these deportation population transfer Jews, could not leave the areas that they were relocated to on pain of death, and of course were subjected to the usual dhimmi conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just nonsense.
Well, you know, it is nonsense, but here again, it's influential. I was reading a recent book, Islam and Islamism, by BOSTOM, and you know, we discussed this, and I still intend, if my schedule ever opens up, to write a review of it, in which he directly attacks your work and says that there is no Islamic anti-Semitism.
Oh,
it's not an institutionalized concept. And BOSTOM is another influential scholar.
Right, but I'm just saying, Robert, that's what Lewis told them. That's why he says it, you know.
Yeah, there you go. And so this is why this program is necessary. It's these falsehoods, these comforting falsehoods, are unfortunately very prevalent. And with the insofar as they abet the agenda of the Islamic supremacist propaganda machine, they're actively dangerous. And we've already discussed, you know, the policy errors, the difficulties that have arisen from them. Can you give us any other areas in which you find that Lewis's work is dangerously misleading or deficient?
Yeah, now, I certainly don't agree with, I think it wound up being $1 or something that he was supposed to pay, and I don't know if he ever paid up, but the idea of suing him for his opinions about the Armenian genocide is just ridiculous. What is striking, though, is that in Lewis's classic work on the evolution of the Republic of Turkey out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, it's called The Emergence of Modern Turkey. The first edition of that work calls the Armenian genocide not only a genocide, he calls it a terrible Holocaust. He actually uses that word. Well, by the time the second edition rolls around, he's taken out that word. He's reduced the casualty figures. He gives no explanation for this, by the way. And he says that it basically was a civil war between the Armenians and the Turks.
Yeah, except only one side had weapons. He reduced the casualty figures and didn't give any source for the revision?
No.
Extraordinary.
He just edits it out. And, you know, he was interviewed about this and said that an Israeli scholar, actually, of Armenian Jewish relations, who's very good on this subject matter, wrote 2 books about the denial of the Armenian genocide in Israel and outside Israel. And he points out that, you know, Lewis always talked about how he was going to present the case and never personally presented it. And of course, it's become the domain of these really shady characters that are pseudo scholars that are paid by the Turkish government. It's a very it's not quite as bad as Holocaust denial, but it heads in that direction. And it's really a shame that he would entertain this scholarship, and you know, I don't really understand it, because obviously he felt differently at some point, and he's never offered a reasonable explanation.
Incredible. You know, the Armenian genocide took place in the modern era. There's abundant documentation of it, and it seems to me to be the height of academic irresponsibility to take such a crucial piece of information as the casualty figures and change it, and then offer no explanation for the change and no source for the new figure.
Well, it's also consistent with his Robert. It's also consistent with his, you know, very, very superficial understanding of the jihad. This was a classic jihad. You know, I think Bat Yor did a lot to emphasize this. Good Armenian historians of the genocide, like Dadrian, and often relying on her work, have emphasized this as well. This was a classic jihad for violating the Dhimma. And how Lewis could not understand that even in the theological terms. Again, even when he was calling it a terrible Holocaust, it was more along the lines of modern nationalistic sectarian violence. It was a classic jihad, and that's the part that you begin to wonder. How thoroughly grounded is he really in some of these doctrines? It's not the sort of understanding that serious scholars of the jihad would have of this kind of historical example.
It's kind of amazing to imagine that a scholar of such immense accomplishment would have lacunae in his own scholarship. And yet, I think that you've made a very important point, because there really isn't any sustained discussion that I can recall of jihad as such in Lewis. And I have seen some things, but they're basically just a sentence or two, where he seems to acknowledge its reality as warfare against unbelievers, but then to slight this topic that has been so absolutely central to Islamic history, theology, and law, and not to give it a more substantial treatment is itself a grave omission and a telling one.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, the other thing is that even when the summary statements, again, for example, because as I mentioned earlier, I was told that one of his better treatments, at least in terms of the theology, is the political language of Islam. And it is. It's better than some of his later summary, more popularized works. But it's purely about doctrine. There's never, and the reason the legacy of jihad was so long is because I felt, you can't just illustrate the repetitiveness and the consistency of the doctrine without giving equal weight to how it was applied in all its gory details. In medicine and medical school, we were forced to memorize so much material. We use these mnemonic devices. And my mnemonic device for jihad was MPED, M-P-E-D, massacre, pillage, enslavement, and deportation.
Wait a minute, you learned about jihad in medical school?
Yeah, I applied the mnemonic device to my
Was this Al-Azhar Medical School?
Pardon?
Was this Al-Azhar Medical School?
Yeah, Al-Azhar Medical School. But,
yes.
but seriously, I mean, he doesn't give you the gory details. I mean, there are tremendous chronicles. There are modern works which will describe the unpleasant details, both in terms of the celebratory chronicles of the Muslims and the painful chronicles of their victims. And this is something that I learned again from our colleague from Bat Yor, that you have to lay this material out because, first of all, for historical accuracy, but also because it frequently illustrates how the doctrines were applied.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is, of course, it's inseparable from how they can be properly understood, because it's clear that if they're applied in a particular way, then they're understood in that way, and that is the mainstream understanding of the doctrine itself. It reminds me of the contemporary Islamic apologists who claim that Sharia has never been implemented in world history and has not been today. And I think, I can't believe that there are Americans who fall for this, when there are avowedly and proudly Sharia states, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, to a great degree, Sudan, North Sudan now, and others that where Sharia is openly implemented, and it always has this particular character. And so if that's not Sharia, then there's been some sort of misunderstanding of Islam on a scale much more massive than anyone has imagined. But the reality is that it's as simply absurd as it is in this case as well.
Yeah, and it really strikes of that terrible apologetic on the left in Western countries during the height of the brutality of communist totalitarianism. Communists, what have you done to communism? It's nonsense. I mean, there's a doctrine and its application.
Yeah, I remember actually I knew a communist in college when I was a leftist myself, and She used to tell me that communism had never been implemented. And
Yeah.
it was very hard for me to swallow even then, because I thought all these people have been working so hard in the Soviet Union, in China, in North Korea, in North Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. All these people have been trying so hard to implement communism, and we're supposed to believe that none of them have gotten it right. And
Right.
it seems to be the same thing in all these cases, that there is a tremendous unreality in the analyses. And that, of course, is here again why we have had this discussion tonight. And I want to thank you very much, Dr. Andrew BOSTOM, for being with us. We're almost out of time. Do you
Bob, can
have
I
any
throw in one thing
summation?
that's really important?
Yes.
You know, I discovered this when I was analyzing the Aberdeen family's, you know, pro-jihadist journal, as I called it, which was the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs, which was the mouthpiece for the Institute of Muslim Minority Affairs, which is essentially a Saudi Wahhabi Muslim Brotherhood front set up by the Aberdeen family, by Papa Aberdeen, run by his wife after he died. The brothers and sisters, Huma and Heba and Hassan, have all served extended periods on the editorial board. Huma herself for 12 years. Her two siblings are still on the board. Guess who else served on that board for 13 years?
Who?
Bernard Lewis.
Well, there you have it.
So here he became a shill for this mouthpiece of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Wahhabi lobby, and didn't even realize it, I assume. And no sooner is he off the editorial board than within a couple of years they're critiquing him.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's not surprising. It's par for the course. Andrew BOSTOM, it's been a very illuminating discussion, an important one that in a perfect world, policymakers, academics, and analysts would take heed and would be very extraordinarily careful in implementing any more recommendations from Bernard Lewis, as great a scholar as he undeniably is. Thank you very much for being with us, and this has been
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Jihad Watch program, and we will be back again next week, God willing, and thank you very much. Good night.